David Carter sat on a cold, damp sidewalk behind a small cafe, the winter wind biting at his exposed face. His tattered army jacket offered little protection, but it was the only reminder of his years in the military, a time when he had a purpose and was regarded as a hero. His hollow eyes stared at the steam rising from a small paper cup of coffee, a rare act of kindness from a stranger who had stopped by earlier. For David, the coffee wasn't just a drink. It was a momentary warmth against the unrelenting cold of a life spent being invisible. As he sipped the coffee, his mind wandered back to the days of his service. He had been a soldier with unwavering resolve, someone who had faced danger without hesitation. But those memories were now drowned in the noise of his current reality, the ache of hunger, the sting of rejection, and the shame of being overlooked. Society had turned its back on him, leaving him to fend for himself in a world that no longer cared. His brief respite was interrupted by the sharp voice of the cafe manager. "Hey, you! You can't stay here! This is private property!" David's heart sank. He wasn't bothering anyone, just trying to find a moment of peace. The manager's voice grew louder, drawing attention from nearby customers. Embarrassed, but too exhausted to argue, David stood up slowly, clutching his coffee. "Move along, or I'm calling the police!" The manager barked. True to his word, the police arrived minutes later. David didn't resist as they questioned him. He had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. They escorted him to the station, where he was processed and handed a court summons. As he left the station, his shoulders slumped under the weight of despair. He shuffled through the streets, questioning why he was still alive and whether his existence meant anything to anyone. A week later, David found himself in a packed courtroom. He had spent the last few nights sleeping under a bridge, the summons tucked safely in his duffel bag. The courtroom's warmth was a stark contrast to the cold outside, but David couldn't shake the chill in his heart. As his name was called, he walked to the stand, his old military boots scuffing against the polished floor. He stood before the judge, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority. "Mr. Carter," she began, "you've been charged with trespassing. How do you plead?" David hesitated, his voice cracking as he answered, "Guilty, Your Honor." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Would you care to explain yourself?" Taking a deep breath, David began to speak. His words were slow and measured, as though each one carried the weight of his pain. He recounted his journey, the years spent serving his country, the camaraderie of his unit, and the pride he once felt wearing his uniform. But then came the difficult part, the transition back to civilian life. "When I came back," he said, his voice faltering, "everything fell apart. There was no support, no guidance. I used up all my savings trying to make ends meet. My family, they didn't understand what I was going through. Eventually, they stopped answering my calls. I lost my home, my dignity, and myself." The courtroom grew silent as David continued. "I sold my Medal of Honor to survive," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to, but I had no choice. That medal was supposed to mean something, but in the end, it couldn't keep me warm or feed me." As David spoke, the judge leaned forward, her expression softening. Something about his story struck a chord. She studied his face carefully, and a flicker of recognition crossed her features. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "did you serve in the Gulf War?" David nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I was part of the unit that secured Al-Khafji." The judge's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Do you remember saving a wounded soldier during that mission? A young man named Nathan Caldwell?" David's brow furrowed as he searched his memory. "Yes, I do. He was badly injured. I carried him to safety under fire." The judge's eyes filled with tears. "Nathan was my father. He told me about the man who saved his life. He said he owed you everything." The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge composed herself. "Mr. Carter," she said firmly, "the charges against you are dismissed. But this isn't enough. You don't deserve to be here, standing alone. I will ensure that you receive the help you need. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." As David stepped down, overwhelmed by the turn of events, he felt a flicker of hope, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, it seemed that someone saw him not as a burden, but as a man who had given everything for his country. David Carter sat on a cot in the small, temporary shelter he had been placed in following the court's intervention. It wasn't much, just a room with peeling paint, and a bed that creaked with the slightest movement. But it was the first time in years he wasn't sleeping under an open sky. As he looked at the bare walls, he still found it hard to believe the events of the courtroom. The judge's words played over in his mind, sparking something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, a woman stood there, her professional attire and kind smile immediately setting her apart from most visitors. "Mr. Carter, my name is Emma Blake. I'm a journalist. I heard your story, and I'd like to share it with the world," she said. David hesitated. He had grown accustomed to being ignored, dismissed, or judged. Why would his story matter to anyone now? Sensing his hesitation, Emma continued. "Your story is important, Mr. Carter. You're not just one man who fell through the cracks. You represent thousands of veterans who have been forgotten. If you're willing, I'd like to help make sure your voice is heard." After a long pause, David nodded. "All right," he said quietly, "but only if this helps others like me." Emma spent hours with David, listening as he recounted his life before and after the military. She wrote furiously as he spoke, weaving his words into a compelling narrative. By the time she left, David felt both drained and strangely lighter. 2 days later, Emma's article, "The Forgotten Hero: How Society Failed David Carter," was published online. The piece painted a vivid picture of David's bravery during the Gulf War, the sacrifices he made, and the harsh realities he faced upon returning home. It was raw, emotional, and unapologetically critical of the system that had abandoned him. Within hours, the article began to gain traction. Comments flooded in from readers, many expressing outrage, guilt, or admiration. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags like #HackForgottenHero and "Support Our Veterans." Strangers shared the article, demanding accountability and action. David was oblivious to the storm brewing online until the shelter director approached him. "David, your story is everywhere," she said, showing him the article on her phone. He stared at the screen, stunned, as he read the words Emma had written. The attention didn't stop there. Local news stations picked up the story, and David found himself approached by reporters, activists, and even strangers who wanted to help. At first, he felt overwhelmed, unsure how to navigate this sudden spotlight. But as letters of gratitude and support poured in, he realized that people truly cared, not just about him, but about the countless others who shared his plight. One letter stood out to him. It was from a young woman who wrote, "My father is a veteran, and your story made me realize how much I've taken him for granted. Thank you for opening my eyes." David held the letter close, feeling for the first time in years that his life had meaning again. As the days turned into weeks, David's story became a rallying cry for change. Veterans organizations across the country began using his story as an example of the systemic failures plaguing their community. Rallies were organized, demanding increased funding for veteran housing, healthcare, and mental health support. Politicians, eager to align themselves with the growing movement, began proposing new legislation aimed at addressing these issues. Emma Blake's article had not only given David a voice, but had ignited a national conversation. Donations began pouring into veteran assistance programs, many accompanied by notes inspired by David's courage. One donation stood out. A local business had raised enough money to secure temporary housing for 10 homeless veterans in the area. David, still adjusting to his newfound recognition, was approached by a woman at one of the rallies. She handed him a piece of paper with an address and a phone number. "This is the contact for a long-term shelter," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "They help veterans rebuild their lives, housing, therapy, job training. I think they could be a good fit for you." David looked at the paper, overwhelmed by her kindness. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. That night, he stared at the address for hours. It represented more than just a place to stay. It was a symbol of the second chance he never thought he'd have. Meanwhile, Emma was hard at work on a follow-up article, this time focusing on the broader systemic failures that had allowed veterans like David to fall through the cracks. She interviewed other homeless veterans, advocacy groups, and policymakers, determined to turn the attention David's story had garnered into lasting change. The momentum continued to build. Schools began inviting veterans to speak to students about their experiences, fostering a new generation of awareness and gratitude. Community centers organized donation drives and fundraisers, channeling the public's outrage into tangible support. Through it all, David remained humble. When asked to speak at a rally, he hesitated but eventually agreed, standing in front of a crowd for the first time since his military days. "I'm just one man," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I know my story isn't unique. There are thousands of us out there, men and women who served this country and came back to nothing. I'm grateful for the kindness I've been shown, but this isn't about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." The crowd erupted in applause, and David felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he believed that change was possible. David Carter woke up to an unfamiliar sound, his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand of his small but cozy new apartment. He reached over and squinted at the screen, which displayed an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Mr. Carter, this is Major William Hayes from the Department of Defense. I'm calling on behalf of the President of the United States." David sat up, his heart pounding. "The President?" "Yes, sir," the Major confirmed, his tone warm but formal. "Your story has deeply moved the President. He has instructed us to reinstate your Medal of Honor and would like to invite you to a ceremony at the White House to recognize your service and sacrifice formally." David was speechless. For years, he had felt forgotten, discarded by the very system he had dedicated his life to protecting. Now the President of the United States wanted to honor him. I don't know what to say," David stammered. "There's nothing you need to say, sir. Your actions have spoken louder than words ever could." "The nation owes you its gratitude," Major Hayes said sincerely. David agreed to the invitation, though he couldn't shake his nerves. The idea of standing in the White House, in front of cameras and dignitaries, was almost too much to comprehend. But he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every veteran who had been left behind. The weeks leading up to the ceremony were a whirlwind. David was provided with a new suit and a professional haircut, courtesy of a local veterans organization. The transformation was startling. When he looked in the mirror, he hardly recognized the man staring back. On the day of the ceremony, David arrived at the White House, feeling a mix of awe and anxiety. The grand hall was filled with government officials, military personnel, and members of the press. As he waited for his name to be called, he clutched the small, worn photograph of his old unit, a reminder of the men and women he had fought alongside, some of whom hadn't made it home. When the president finally stepped to the podium, the room fell silent. "Today, we gather to honor a man whose courage and sacrifice embody the very best of what it means to serve this nation," the president began. David Carter not only risked his life for his comrades during the Gulf War, but he also faced immense challenges upon returning home, challenges no hero should ever endure. The president's voice grew firm. "Let David Carter's story serve as a wake-up call. We must do better for our veterans. Today, we take a step in the right direction by returning to Mr. Carter what he should never have had to part with, his Medal of Honor." The room erupted into applause as the president turned to David and presented him with the medal. For a moment, David's vision blurred with tears. As he accepted the honor, he whispered, "Thank you," though he knew this moment was bigger than just himself. The ceremony continued with a poignant speech from David himself. As he stood at the podium, his voice trembled but remained steady. "I am deeply honored to be here today," he began. "But I would be lying if I said I didn't have mixed emotions. This medal represents not just my journey, but the journey of every veteran who has faced the battlefield abroad only to face another battle at home." David paused, looking out at the audience. "For years, I felt invisible. I thought my sacrifices were forgotten. But standing here today, I see that isn't true. To the veterans out there still struggling, know this. You are not alone. People care. Change is possible." The applause was deafening as David stepped away from the podium. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for history. The president shook his hand firmly and thanked him again for his service. After the ceremony, David was approached by several attendees, including high-ranking military officials and members of Congress. They expressed their admiration and, more importantly, their commitment to enacting reforms for veterans. One senator promised to introduce legislation aimed at increasing funding for veteran housing and healthcare programs. David also reconnected with Major Hayes, who had organized the event. The major handed him a small box. "This was found in our archives," Hayes explained. "It's a collection of letters from your old unit. They wrote these during the war, but never had the chance to send them to you. I thought you'd like to have them." David opened the box and was immediately overcome with emotion. The letters were filled with gratitude, admiration, and heartfelt words from the soldiers whose lives he had touched. That night, back in his apartment, David sat at his small dining table, reading the letters one by one. Each one was a reminder of the man he had been and the lives he had impacted. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of closure and a renewed determination to keep fighting, not for himself, but for the countless others still waiting to be seen. As he gazed at the Medal of Honor now displayed proudly on his shelf, David knew his journey wasn't over. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a new mission. He would use his story, his voice, and his platform to ensure that no other veteran was ever forgotten again. The national spotlight on David Carter's story inspired journalist Emma Blake to take her mission further. While her article had ignited widespread attention, she knew that a single piece of writing wasn't enough to sustain the momentum. Emma pitched an idea to her editor: a feature-length documentary that not only delved deeper into David's life, but also highlighted the broader systemic failures faced by veterans across the country. Her editor immediately approved. "If we do this right," he said, "it could be the catalyst for real change." Emma spent the next 6 months traveling the country, interviewing homeless veterans, policymakers, and advocates. The documentary, titled "The Forgotten Frontline: America's Abandoned Veterans," began with David's story. Footage of his White House ceremony played alongside images of his time in the Gulf War, his years of homelessness, and his eventual journey to recognition. David agreed to participate fully, despite his initial hesitation about being in the public eye. "If this helps even one person," he told Emma, "then it's worth it." The documentary painted a stark picture of the challenges veterans faced: crippling PTSD, a lack of mental health resources, bureaucratic red tape in accessing benefits, and an alarming rate of homelessness among those who had served. Emma interviewed men and women from all branches of the military, weaving their stories into a tapestry of resilience, struggle, and systemic neglect. One particularly heart-wrenching moment featured a Vietnam War veteran who had been living in his car for years. "I fought for my country," he said, his voice breaking. "But when I came home, I felt like my country had forgotten about me." When the documentary was finally released, it premiered at a packed theater in Washington, D.C. David sat in the front row, flanked by Emma and members of his old military unit who had traveled from across the country to support him. As the credits rolled, the audience sat in stunned silence, many wiping away tears. The response was immediate and powerful. The documentary quickly gained traction online, becoming one of the most watched films on streaming platforms. Social media buzzed with calls to action, and viewers demanded accountability from lawmakers and organizations. In the weeks following its release, protests were organized across the nation, with citizens demanding better treatment for veterans. Hashtags like Never Forgotten and #Support Our Heroes trended worldwide. Donations to veteran-focused charities surged, and advocacy groups reported a sharp increase in volunteers. But the documentary's impact didn't stop at public awareness. It caught the attention of policymakers, leading to hearings on Capitol Hill. Emma, alongside David and other veterans featured in the film, was invited to testify before Congress. "This isn't just a story," Emma told the panel of lawmakers. "This is a reality for thousands of men and women who served this country. They deserve better. They deserve action." David, in his testimony, was direct and emotional. "I didn't ask for fame or recognition," he said. "But now that I have it, I'm going to use it to speak for those who can't. We need change, real, lasting change." By the end of the hearing, several senators had pledged to introduce new legislation aimed at addressing the issues highlighted in the documentary. Amid the whirlwind of media appearances, public events, and policy discussions, David Carter was quietly beginning to rebuild his life. The donations that poured in after the documentary's release had allowed him to move into a permanent apartment. a modest but warm space he could finally call home. The walls of his apartment were lined with photos of his military service, his family, and the new friends he had made along his journey. One photo held a place of honor, a snapshot of him shaking hands with the president during the Medal of Honor ceremony. Beside it hung the medal itself, gleaming in its case. Rebuilding wasn't easy. David attended regular therapy sessions to confront the trauma he had carried for decades. His therapist, a fellow veteran, helped him navigate the complexities of PTSD and the emotional weight of his newfound role as an advocate. "There's no timeline for healing," she told him during one session. "But every step you take, no matter how small, is a step forward." David also began volunteering at a local veterans center, mentoring younger veterans who were struggling to transition back to civilian life. His story served as a source of inspiration for many. One young veteran, a woman named Jessica, approached him after a group session. "Your story gave me hope," she said. "For the first time, I feel like I'm not alone." David smiled, humbled by her words. "You're not alone," he assured her, "and you never will be." Opportunities continued to come his way. Several organizations reached out with job offers, but David chose to focus on advocacy work. He partnered with Emma to host town hall events where veterans could share their stories directly with the public and local leaders. At one of these events, David met a retired general who had seen the documentary. "You've done more for veterans in the past year than most of us could in a lifetime," the general said. "Keep going. We need voices like yours." As David stood in his apartment one evening, looking at the life he had rebuilt, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He knew his journey wasn't over, but for the first time in years, he was no longer defined by his struggles. He was a survivor, a hero, and a man with a purpose. And he was ready to continue the fight, not just for himself, but for every veteran who still needed to be seen, heard, and supported. David Carter's story had become a symbol of hope across the country. Everywhere he went, people recognized him, not as the homeless man he once was, but as a beacon of resilience and a reminder of what the human spirit could endure and overcome. Veteran charities saw a surge in donations, some even reporting record-breaking contributions. Grassroots movements emerged in communities nationwide, focused on supporting veterans through housing programs, job training, and mental health services. These movements often cited David's journey as their inspiration, dubbing him the forgotten hero. David's schedule became a whirlwind of events, interviews, and speaking engagements. He was invited to speak at colleges, community centers, and national conferences, sharing not only his personal experiences, but also the broader message of systemic reform. At one event held in Chicago, David stood before a packed auditorium. The crowd buzzed with anticipation as he approached the microphone. Taking a deep breath, he began. "When I was living on the streets, I felt invisible," he said. "I thought my life didn't matter anymore. But now, standing here, looking out at all of you, I know that no one is ever truly invisible. Every life matters, and every story deserves to be heard." The audience erupted into applause. After his speech, dozens of people approached him, eager to shake his hand or share how his story had inspired them. Among them was a young man named Tyler, who nervously handed David a letter. "This is for you," Tyler said. "I've been struggling since I got back from my deployment, but your story helped me believe that I could rebuild my life too." David read the letter later that evening, tears filling his eyes. Tyler wrote about his battle with PTSD and how he had been on the verge of giving up until he saw David's documentary. "You showed me that it's never too late to find purpose again," Tyler wrote. David kept the letter in his wallet, a constant reminder of why he had chosen this path. One of the most touching moments of his advocacy journey came when he was invited to speak at a memorial service for fallen soldiers. Standing at a podium draped with the American flag, he addressed a crowd of grieving families. "Your loved ones are heroes," David said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "And while they may no longer be with us, their legacy lives on. I promise to honor their memory by continuing to fight for the men and women who served alongside them." As he stepped away, a woman approached him, tears streaming down her face. "My son always admired you," she said, clutching a photograph of a young soldier. "He used to talk about how you saved his unit during the Gulf War. Thank you for everything." David hugged her tightly, both of them finding solace in the shared moment. His advocacy work began to create tangible change. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at improving veteran health care, housing, and employment opportunities. Several of these bills passed, marking a significant step forward in addressing the issues that had plagued the veteran community for years. David's voice had become a rallying cry, his resilience a beacon of hope for countless others. In the years since his story first gained national attention, David Carter had come to embrace his role as both an advocate and a symbol of change. Sitting in his modest but comfortable apartment one evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The Medal of Honor, displayed proudly on a shelf in his living room, gleamed under the soft glow of a nearby lamp. It wasn't just a symbol of his bravery on the battlefield. It represented the second chance he had been given and the lives he hoped to touch. David agreed to a follow-up interview with journalist Emma Blake, who had become a close friend and collaborator. The two sat in his living room, the cameras rolling as Emma began. "David, when we first met, you were living on the streets, uncertain about your future. Now, you're a national symbol of resilience and hope. How does it feel to look back on everything that's happened?" David smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the weight of his journey. "It feels surreal. There were times when I thought I wouldn't survive another day, let alone see my story make an impact. But if I've learned anything, it's that no matter how dark things get, there's always a chance for light to break through." Emma leaned forward. "What's next for you, David? What do you hope to achieve moving forward?" "I want to keep fighting for those who feel forgotten," he said firmly. "There are still too many veterans out there who need help, who need to know that their sacrifices mattered. I'm just one man, but I hope my story shows that change is possible." As the interview wrapped up, Emma turned to the camera. David Carter's journey is a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of community. While his story has inspired millions, it's also a call to action, a reminder that we must never stop fighting for those who fought for us. The segment aired to widespread acclaim, further solidifying David's status as a national hero. Later that evening, David sat alone in his apartment, reading through letters and messages from people whose lives he had touched. One message stood out, a simple note from a veteran who had recently found housing thanks to one of the programs David had helped promote. "Because of you," the message read, "I have a home and hope for the future. Thank you for reminding me that I matter." David placed the note beside the Medal of Honor, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. His life had come full circle, from the depths of despair to a place of purpose and impact. As he looked out the window at the city lights below, David knew his journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, battles to fight, and lives to change. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. His story wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption, resilience, and the power of a second chance. And with every step he took, David Carter ensured that no veteran would ever feel invisible again. David Carter's journey was a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of compassion. From the depths of despair to the heights of recognition, his life became a beacon of hope for countless veterans and individuals who felt lost and forgotten. Through his unwavering determination and the support of those who believed in him, David transformed his pain into purpose. His voice echoed across the nation, inspiring change, uniting communities, and shining a light on the struggles faced by so many who had served their country. But David's story was more than just a tale of survival. It was a testament to the strength of the collective will to do better. It reminded society of its responsibility to care for those who had given so much, to ensure no one was left behind. As David continued his advocacy work, his life became a legacy, proving that even in the darkest moments, there is always a path forward. His story wasn't just his own. It belonged to every veteran who dreamed of a better tomorrow, every family who longed for justice, and every person who believed in the power of hope. David Carter's name would forever be etched into the hearts of a grateful nation, not just as a forgotten hero rediscovered, but as a symbol of what could be achieved when people come together to fight for what is right. In the end, his journey wasn't just about finding his way back to a life of dignity and purpose. It was about paving the way for others to do the same. And for that, David Carter would never be forgotten again. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to David Carter's incredible story. His journey of resilience, hope, and redemption reminds us all of the power of compassion and the importance of standing together for those in need. If this story moved or inspired you, we'd love for you to share it with others. Your support means the world to us and helps amplify these powerful messages. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring story. Together, we can continue to share stories that matter and make a real difference in the world. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us, and we'll see you in the next video.